this is like a sort of semi-homecoming. Mississippi's been part of my life for 5-6 years now, and you know, it's meant a lot to me, you know, to build community here, and yeah, you know, I used to come to all of the events here, and well, not all of them, but you know, good number, and to be sitting on this side is pretty surreal. So thank y'all again. And I'm gonna read a little passage for a little I guess context. This is a book from about 3 perspectives. Mainly it's a conversation between mother and son. But here and there you get some of the grandmother. And yeah, so this is her voice. The June heat set the day in its lap and wrapped the city in its arms as proof. Audrey pulled a weed from the soft soil of a small garden and wondered whether the day had ever wanted room to grow. It sits all day, and every day, the world in its lap, watching trees stretch toward its light. Audrey looked up, jealous of the day, wondering, is it ever jealous of me? As the sun hung over the trees, the mosquitoes would join, a song of blood. Audrey usually worked in the mornings before the heat, planting green onion and cucumber. Today she had to begin a little before noon. The soil was dark and rich between her fingers. The garden was a square plot behind her apartment building. When she had found it years ago, abandoned and littered with drug vials, soda cans, and other scraps, she had cleared the plot out and begun putting down a layer of topsoil. She then began working this tiny piece of land, despite her bad knees and lower back that flared up if she bent too long. Audrey gathered some of what she had been growing. Sweet blueberries, tomatoes, a cross from mustard greens, leeks, and a couple peaches from a slender tree. Being close to the soil cooled her skin under the noon sun. It took her mind away from the fact that it would be gone soon. Her home wouldn't belong to her anymore, as if it ever had. When she was a young girl, she would spend every summer on her grandfather's farm. She hated it. It was the 50s, and Audrey was more interested in going to the cotillions, the debutante balls, drinking tea with the fancy Southern women who offered their homes for plantation tours, than toiling over farm work. She watched the carrot seed grow and milled around, doing a bunch of yard work when she'd rather just clean the house. You'll thank me later, her father would say. He showed her how to plant the seeds in rows along the furrows they made, measuring how deep into the earth, how far apart. His big hands kneaded hers into the cool, damp soil. She was more interested in the movie theater that offered tickets for 10 cents, the diner so crowded at midnight that folks spilled out into its back porch, the boys who were wide as trees that lined her grandfather's property. Back then, every boy in North Carolina had a car and no reasonable curfew. They spoke slowly, more to their body's cadence. Not like Georgia boys or Mississippi boys, too fast with their mouths full of rocks or gold. Virgil was no different, talking to her as sweet and slow as growing molasses. He was sun-dried and tall, blocking the sun rays from her eyes when she looked up at him. And he was just a boy then, genuine, but with something unquenchable behind his eyes. He drove his car too fast and came home when the sun was just above the hills. Audrey hoped to beat the morning before the dew set over the land like a spirit, before her grandfather, old as all hell, rolled out of his bed to check the farm. And the sun climbing higher and higher, her grandfather would ride into town on the back of his wagon, tumbling among the canvas bags stuffed with the potatoes he harvested. He had been a sharecropper as a young man, on the same plantation he had worked as a boy. He always told the story of how he got the farm, how a slave ended up with a few acres from some crops and a mule. Her father forced her to sit around and listen, sprawled across the carpet of Grandpa's bed, warming their hands around mugs of lemon juice and honey and boiled water. At the end of one of those summers, as the sun rose later and later. One morning, the carrot was fully bloomed. She stared in wonder at this orange stump with roots disappearing into the soil. It was the brightest thing she had ever seen. Audrey looked up now, sweating, surrounded by fruit flies. Across the street were building fronts, lopsided and too close to one another, packed along the sidewalk like crooked teeth. Nina Simone's live interpretation of Take My Hand, Precious Lord, played on her stereo, a cheap wireless speaker shoved into the soil, tucked somewhere between the greens and the peaches. Key had brought it for her one Christmas, tired of her mother's complaining about the cheap earbuds. Above her hung a billboard advertising an old discount at Jack's World from a couple years ago. Car horns blared over the distant buzz of construction and busy Halal parks. Her joints throbbed, her knees heavy with water. Thank you.
That reading, that was one of so many beautiful passages that I have dog-eared in my art that I got of We Are Hunting. This is the Southern launch, you said, for your book tour? Right. So my first question is about, there's a blurb that our friend Kiese Lehman wrote about the novel, saying it's very New York, but located also quite Southern. And I felt that as well. And I wonder if you could talk about that duality and how it came to be.
I think, just kind of what I alluded to earlier, the experience of living here for 5 to 6 years. And it came at the best time too, because so I'm writing this like inherently New York story about where I come from, my upbringing, all of this, but suddenly I'm sort of entrenched in kind of the language or the kind of signifiers of like the southern landscape. I'm like taken by, a little bit of its flatness, the hills, the sort of, the natural environment. And it made me kind of want to pay attention to my own neighborhood in a similar way. So my old community, it's called East New York, it's in Brooklyn. And it's like typical kind of urban landscape, you imagine, apartments and tenements and warehouses and all that. But it's on marshland. It used to be a lot of swampland, and like the mob used to bury bodies back then. It's an interesting place. But it was such a juxtaposition for me, growing up in like a tenement house, public housing, but yet, there's all this kind of where we live on like an estuary overlooking a bay, like into the Atlantic Ocean. So this kind of like carrying these two things, and I think being in Mississippi, tracing my family's lineage, sort of the paths of like the Great Migration and stuff like that. It led me to sort of, pick at the story in different ways than maybe if I had stayed in New York.
I was going to say there are definitely echoes of the Great Migration, even though I think that it's the generation just after, Audrey's generation sort of, was born there.
Right.
Well, Audrey came with Verge, so, but by that time, I think the Great Migration is like through 1940 or something, but it had those same sort of echoes, so I was very curious about that. Well, we know the migration never stopped, but the official
Right.
migration.
Right.
And so I'm curious about the structure of the story in terms of which came first for you, the characters or the premise?
That's a great question. Definitely, I think the characters.
Okay.
The first voice that came to me was the son, because again, this is a story about a family. More importantly, it's a story of a conversation between a mother and a son. And then you get that sort of 3-generation dynamic with Audrey, the grandmother. But the first voice that came to me was Collie, was the son, because well, first I thought I was writing a collection of short stories. Then I thought I was writing a coming of age story. Then I realized I'm writing something much more than that. But there is that coming of age element, and it was the loneliness and despair of kind of a young man growing up and being into like art and music and dealing with grief, but also dealing with such like a harsh environment. And navigating that. And then Key's voice came to me, and I think that sort of unlocked the entire story of sort of what I was doing or what I wanted to do with the story. Because with Key came the conversation, the generations, the gift. I imagine Key as just this woman who boosted clothes from her job, but finds kind of meaning in this gift, in this, being able to see ghosts. And yeah, I think those connections sort of unlock the story for me. Yeah.
So as you mentioned, you've written these characters across genders, across generations, and all of the voices ring so true.
Right.
From a craft perspective, can you talk a little bit about how you own that?
I think craft-wise, so being devoted first off to wanting to write, I didn't want to necessarily write about like Black people in white spaces, no offense, to sort of projects or work that does that, but it was a devotion to sort of exploring Blackness, poverty, working class communities wholeheartedly, and then wanting to kind of upend that with like sort of the supernatural, right? I always bring up kind of the horror, like there's this panel talking about Black horror writers.
I saw that today. Yes.
And sort of like our history is horror, and thinking about like how, sort of pushing the boundaries of genre, how that sort of, because, to talk about some of the things like we go through or the surreal nature of Blackness, you kind of have to lean into some of those elements to even sort of explain what we've been through. So I think it was a real sort of commitment first to wanting to be honest about Black working class communities and explore that, but also finding ways to not just write from this place of like this trauma narrative, but to sort of, sort of untap the supernatural, the surreal. And like hopefully that kind of troubles like this typical like traumatic, poverty stricken sort of stories that we always seem to get. And I wanted to make it literary. I wanted to be devoted to these characters and being not just honest about them, but like they deserve kind of to be in literature. They deserve to be in the capital L literature. Yeah.
Was there a particular character or voice that was a little harder than the others to nail?
I think both the women characters. Even though Audrey, I liked a bit more because she was just kind of like fuck it all the time. Like, she's kind of just, she knows who she is.
Yes.
Key is kind of like in that discovery process. So I think, and then wanting to get it right, wanting to write from a woman's perspective and like, try to come close to, doing that right. And a lot of that stems from just like listening. listening to my mom, my aunts, my cousins, my friends. A lot of it was reading, women, sort of characters that I fell in love with. So Sula. A lot of it was theory. So a lot of it was reading Audrey or Margaret T. Christian. And I think hopefully kind of reading that, and then also key being a mix of all of these things, and also being into being able to see ghosts, right? So this whole sort of travel, her being able to see ghosts and it extending into like the spiritual practice of like the Yoruba, right? So like this West African practice that through colonialism sort of became syncretic in various places in the Americas. So you have like all these properties of Yoruba and like say voodoo in Haiti and Santeria in Cuba and Puerto Rico. And all of this is, kind of, death is not the end. That's the goal. So like doing all of that research, the language, researching different kind of spiritual practices, that stuff was hard. And yeah, I kind of navigated it the same way as Keith in this sort of sense of discovery.
And one of the things that was hard for me reading is that we learned that, sorry for the spoilers, that Key dies, and then we get to know her, which I thought was a really powerful structural choice because, I was just sad. I mean, I'll talk later about the parts where I was crying, but that was really difficult. But I appreciate the way you introduced us to her, and then it gave us a great, because as you're talking about Kali and Satoya, to understand their grief as we're getting to know them. So that was, I thought, a really powerful structural choice. You mentioned a minute ago that you thought this was going to be a collection of short stories and then coming of age and then so forth with the supernatural elements coming in. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about process and the business surrounding writing. And I don't know if you know the writer Carmen Maria Machado, who, fantastic. She has a Substack that everybody should be subscribed to. And one of her recent newsletters, she was writing on, it's called On Writing and the Business of Writing. She talks about the pressure and the rush to publish, especially after an MFA. And so she talked about leaving Iowa and not having any agents be interested in her work and feeling bad, but now she's thankful that she had that time. So could you kind of walk us through that time, window of time for you between completing your MFA and then here we are celebrating your book?
Yeah. Okay. So I graduated 2020 during the pandemic. Like right when the pandemic, so I didn't even get to like walk the stage or anything. But yeah, so most of my thesis was, I think, the first two parts of this novel, give or take. I think part of the work was figuring out if it was ready, if it was like ready to send out, or should I like keep working on it. And like I ended up, working on it as well, but like, sort of doing it, pitching it and stuff like that. But luckily, I had a great support system. So, a lot of my thesis advisors, a lot of my like former professors, just sort of maintaining that relationship. A lot of them, I'll pass your name along to an agent, or even our program invited agents to the program to speak with us. So I think just take advantage of those opportunities. Luckily, Kiese, bless his heart, when he was here, his agent, he managed to pass my name along to his agent, and I met with him, and there was a real symbiosis, like each other, and again, there's a difference, you know, like my agent PJ, he's very, very present, especially in that sort of lead up into sort of pitching. So he helped work with me to edit, he helped work with me to finish the book and make it this whole thing. You know, a lot of agents aren't that like hands-on, so. But, and that process is important because, you know, some people like the opposite. And some people like, you know, having a, I guess, pretty involved in a sense. But yeah, and then the process of pitching was interesting, you know, and you kind of have to mediate your expectations and kind of remember that you're selling something. You know, you're you know, this is your baby, this is your art, this is, you know, but this is industry, and then mediating again your expectations. So luckily, again, just like the process of meeting like different publishing houses and editors, again, it's like that same sort of like, what do you want out of the relationship, or what's most beneficial to you as a writer, and so, and this might be to you, but you know, I had offers from you know, the big three, like, you know, sort of the major publishing houses. And I went with Astor House, which is pretty new, sort of up and coming publisher, but they have distribution through Penguin Random House. So just looking for unique situations that work for you, that benefits you. So I wanted the indie kind of attention that a small publisher could give you, and being, you know, kind of pushed to the forefront and all that stuff, while also being distributed by like a major kind of publishing thing. So it's kind of mediating that, and instead of just going for the big name and the glitz and, you know, all that stuff. So yeah, that's my process.
Would it be fair to say that you like revision? And I want to talk about revision because not everybody does, but you kind of mentioned it just very casually, like it was just you know, very organic for you.
Right.
Or do you kind of fight it kicking and screaming?
I'm constantly revising.
Okay, good.
I feel like part of my process is revising.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard for me to have like drafts. Like, I mean, I do have drafts, but a lot of, like, I'll work on the same page and a half for days and days and days, and then like generate something. Then I'll work on that for days and days and days, but constantly kind of, you know, up to my standards. And then I'll get to the end and then I'll be, oh, this has to be revised, and then I'll revise it again. But like for me, that's inherent in sort of the process, the generative writing process.
So you don't resist it. You take feedback well.
Yes, okay. I can't resist it.
All right. So your editor's probably very happy.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and then my editor's pretty, he's pretty chill himself. So, I mean, he approaches it, you know, he's not a writer, so he's in amazement at what we do.
Mm-hmm.
So he's pretty, you know, I'm just going to tell you this punctuation is wrong. Mm-hmm. And, you know, and suggest sort of other sort of things, but like I've never had to thankfully take something out or remove something or change sort of the essence of this book mm-hmm. from what it is mm-hmm. to, you know, to stuff.
That is wonderful because that's not always the case. Let's see. Did you have thinking about the response, what the response has been to the novel so far, has there been a response that surprised you?
Yes and no. And this might be a little, but and the response has been great. It's been glowing. And I don't think I ever expected, to be on like a bestsellers list or anything like that. I'm very satisfied that the book is like in conversation with people actually doing like serious work. You know what I mean? So I guess I shouldn't be surprised. I think the most surprising thing, twofold, but like we'll see if we get to the second one. But the first thing is people asking why I would write about this community, these people. Like I've had several bookstore owners or just agents or just people being like, why do you want to write about, this place?
They're saying, why do you want to write about the place you came from? Really?
Right, yeah.
And they said it out loud.
Yeah. Right. And it's like, I know. But, and that goes to show you, like, what people think of these environments and stuff like that. And it hasn't just been white. It's been black people. So it ranges, and I think again, it's sort of the intersectionalities of blackness, right? So like, we can write about black communities, but writing about working class communities is when it poses an issue, right? When people just like seize up. So yeah, I've been asked like, why East New York? Because even in New York, even in Brooklyn, like people, like I'll be like, oh, I'm from East New York. People are like, oh my God, you're from East New York? Like it sort of has that reputation, and it's sad, it's bad, and it makes me feel, like people don't recognize how that makes a person feel, which is literally why I wrote it, because this deserves to be in literature. This place, these people deserve to be written about in a serious, gentle, careful fashion.
And very loving, I would say. The love you have for your community is all through the pages.
Thank you. That means the most.
And you said there was a second thing that you respond?
I mean, it kind of relates back to that, but just the class kind of thing, what gets exalted, what seems to get exalted. The narratives surrounding black folks, who gets to get championed. And yeah, I think it relates to the conversations in the book. So like, are you writing this to sort of, are you writing a representational black meant to represent a culture in this space, or are you writing to like genuinely speak to or exchange with your community? And I think I fall in the latter, hopefully. And I think that plays a part in how certain things are treated or accepted or kind of propped up.
So I'll ask one last question, and then we'll take questions from the audience. You just said a minute ago about the book being in conversation with other serious themes, and I'm thinking around environmentalism, around grief. For me personally, the motherhood thing jumped out and was cause for me setting the book down many, many times, because it was really hitting home for me in terms of the loss of the mother from cancer. What are some of the books that you feel your book is in conversation with, and were you reading some of those books as you were writing?
Yeah. Sing and Verge Sing, which I have to put down because it's one of those. And it really helped me kind of, because that's definitely a book about grief, but it's also a book that extends spiritually, in a sense. Heavy, of course, by P.S.A. Lehman. Go get that. Fortress of Solitude by Jonathan Lethem, which is another coming-of-age story in Brooklyn. But I sort of wrote into that. And also Jazz by Toni Morrison. I think the language, she takes on the perspective of the city. Like the narrator is the city, and just like on a line level, she's wreaking havoc, and it's amazing. And yeah, I really looked into that and sort of, because in that book as well, there's sort of the Great Migration element. There's sort of, it takes place in New York, but there's like these remnants of the South that come screaming forward. And yeah, I think
anything else you want to touch on before we talk about the conversation? You said you might have had a question for me. I just want to make sure we will.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, I have a question for you about the Secret Life.
Oh. Okay.
So, but yeah, I guess it's rooted in that same commitment to community. I guess I wanted to ask, did you feel that in writing your characters or your stories? Like, was there like some response to the kind of the narrative of like Black stories and Black books? Like, was that
like reader responses?
Right.
I'm just thrilled with what I heard. Like, people didn't let me down. I was really happy about that, because what I had observed happening, I mean, we've seen it historically, like with August Wilson and with Toni Morrison, where interviewers would say, why do you limit yourself by writing just about Black life? And they both would have amazing answers to that. But I kind of really leaned into August Wilson's answer, which was, he said, I could write about the Black experience in America forever, because you're writing about love, you're writing about duty, honor, fathers, mothers, sisters, brothers, grief, all the things. It's just within a specific community with specific characters, and even in that specificity, there are points of connection and access for people who aren't a part of that community. But what I had experienced was, people kind of took that approach, like, oh yeah, we all have mothers, but then would erase or flatten out the Blackness. And it's like, I know we're better than this. I know that we can do both, that we don't have to erase the Blackness of it for people to still have the connection point. So I didn't know what was going to happen. But then I started, I think the first group of people I heard from that weren't Black women were Black men. And Damon Young, who wrote a memoir, What Doesn't Kill You Makes You Blacker, is a good friend of mine who was one of the first people I was in conversation with the book, and he said, Black men are garnish in this book. They are on the plate, but they're not the meal. And in our conversation, we realized all of us need to read more books where we're the garnish, whether it's around gender or sexuality or whatever it is, where people who are like us aren't centered, so that we can find those access points, and still hold what's different, and not try and flatten it out and say, difference doesn't matter. Difference absolutely matters, And then it was, hearing from people from in other countries. We all have grandmothers. I write about grandmothers, and so hearing people saying, oh, that description of, the grandmother's kitchen and everything reminded me of my grandmother, and it's a French woman who's living in Greece, So I was really happy that was the response, because I wanted everyone to access the book, but I didn't want the erasure of what made it specifically Black and specifically Black women.
That specificity is universal.
Right, absolutely. Thank you. So, questions?
Y'all ought to be on TV. Nice job.
Yes.
So I have a question about your revision process. You said like you're constantly revising. When do you know that you're done? Like, what's that feeling like to think this is the final product? Or this is what I'm going to turn it?
I mean, honestly, like,
I'm still revising.
I'm still revising.
I knew it.
And honestly, like, you'll have your team with, like, hopefully people around you will pull you away from the project, kicking and screaming. But I think I knew. I knew I had. Maybe not talk about this, but in general, I think I know when it's close to completion, when it's hitting certain notes, and then when it's hitting certain notes and when it's doing kind of what I hoped it would do, then that means it's ready for rearrangement, reorganization, throwing this out, taking this. It just means that coming to a place where more revision can be, but we're coming to a place where you can trouble structure or trouble voice or trouble sort of other maybe craft elements that, like, you know, okay, that might change the sort of alignment of the story or you know, but I think there are certain things, a little esoteric, but there are certain like points that you hit that you sort of, all right, this is taking shape. This is a thing. Yeah. Is that
That's great.
sort of answer?
Yeah.
Hi, Tyriek. Could you talk about, sort of the depth you went with towards like setting up the historical framework of your book? How deep in the weeds did you go with that to try to create the past?
Right. Very deep, very deep. So a lot of just archival materials, a lot of research. I always tell about this sort of old newspaper article I found about this church in my community, this like Dutch Reformed church, where, you know, this was like the late 1800s, and this church used to inter white folk, and it was like a little side note that they sometimes interred black folk, but if there's no room, they just like buried them across the street with no headstone or tombstone. And this is like spatially in the place that I'm writing about. So like, you know, just moments like that opens up things narratively. So like I can explore sort of a moment like that. Or researching, you know, old CUNY sort of article or dissertation about sort of spiritual practices or artifacts found in a house during slavery in Brooklyn from the Congo sort of practice. And like, oh, this is Brooklyn. Oh, this is, you know, this sort of relates to what I'm talking about. Finding a lot of moments, you know, in historical accounts, in doing research, in reading about not just my community, because, you know, for me, a lot of just as a black body, just walking throughout my neighborhood and like seeing like street names named after slave owners, it kind of makes you want to just do, you know, research. So I would look up who is, you know, I grew up on Shank Street. Who is Shank? The Brooklyn, so when I had my launch, the Brooklyn Museum has on display the Shank House, the Nicholas Shank House, and this is like Dutch folk who owned slaves, you know, and just kind of the research kind of like is embodied, you know what I mean? It's like just moving through the world kind of almost, and then being intrigued by it, and then, you know, wanting to know more, wanting to know about the community my grandmother grew up in, right, in North Carolina, and doing that research, right, what kind of Warren County, which is like started sort of the environmental movement. Like a lot of people don't know, like, anyway, this is wrong. But, you know, there was pollution and sort of, I think, a chemical leak in somewhere in Warren County recently. Yeah. So you just have these black folk from Warren County, North Carolina, just like organizing around these sort of environmental issues, and historically, just researching that, and yeah, just as you can see, it's embodied, and it's also like investigating literal archives, but also living archives. So the stories of my ancestors, the stories of just my family. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
So, Deesha, you mentioned the pressure for an MFA, recipient to then publish. And so what about the pressure for successful debut novelists, both of you, to publish your second work, and not to add to that pressure, but
decide to not be pressured. And to Rick's point earlier, having a really good agent, a good supportive agent helps with that, because my agent started fielding offers on my next book after the first book came out, and she said, books get written when they get written. We're not going to rush this. And so she's never pressured me, and I'm like, I'm not going to let strangers pressure me. That's not going to happen. And so the only pressure I've sort of let in has been my agent saying, how's it going over there? And I think we can't, like, the world is going to do what it's going to do, and I don't want to contribute to that pressure by pressuring myself, and so I've been thinking, how gentle and kind can I be to myself in this process, right? And so it's sort of predicting the dialogue around my next book, like, oh, can it do what Church Ladies did? And it's like, no, it's not going to do what Church Ladies did, because no book has done that. And so why would I set myself up as, that doesn't make sense to put that pressure on myself. And then I finally came up with this analogy that it's like having multiple children. So those of you who have more than one child know you didn't have the second kid going, I really hope you can do what your older sibling did. I hope you can, lightning can strike twice, in the same place, instead of just letting that kid be who that kid's going to be, because it's not fair to the kid, the second kid. And I feel that same way about, future books, that I need them to just have the same chance that, any other book had, and not put that kind of pressure. I think if I allowed it, I wouldn't be able to write a word, and the standard then for me is, do I love this book? And everything else beyond that is gravy. What do you think about that?
That's a very healthy outlook that I will adopt.
I was just telling you. I wouldn't have had this outlook 20 years ago.
Yeah, no, but very similarly, just kind of protecting that part, because I've been asked several times about it. But it's kind of beautiful. It's like, oh, so I get to come here again. I get to write a second one. Y'all are gonna let me write a second one. That's great. And there's excitement in that. There is like the wonder of ideas and like what I could possibly write next. And I have like ideas, but like, I'm weird. I'm like, oh, that's more of a third, fourth book. And also just sort of kind of thinking about it like albums, right? So like I'm thinking like who has a great sophomore album? I don't know.
You want the album? Like, I want my sophomore album to have just all deep cuts, no skip, just that would be good too, you know.
Or I want my sophomore album to double down, just expand.
Yeah.
There's plenty of approaches, but it's fun now. It's wondrous now until a deadline comes.
I think that's it too. Is just having fun, and you know, writing is work. It's serious work. But there's something about playing and nerding out and getting lost in the archives, like you were saying, and all of that joy. And you know, and I always encourage students to just like hold on to that, because that's the only thing you can control. You can't control how people are going to respond to the book, or if they respond, or whatever. And so, delighting in just nerding out. Other questions?
Yeah, both of you seem to be carrying on that tradition of Toni Morrison encouraging other Black writers, in your 16 writers that you and Robert and Kiese are working with, and then the organization that you're working with. And I'd just like to hear more about what your plans are and what you're doing now.
Well, me, so Land Black, so we offer, well, it began as like a sort of mutual aid organization to just give like micro grants to Black writers. And, you know, it's for, you know, to be a writer, you know, like even on an emerging scale costs money. There's fellowship prices, application fees, there's all these submission fees, there are all these things. So we wanted to address that need first. And then it turned into a magazine, so independent magazine, where CLMP authorized. We're actually finalists for the Firecracker Awards for debut indie magazine, so that's great. We also offer programming, so like reading series and like opportunities for writers. We're collaborating with Mokata in Brooklyn, which is the Museum of Caribbean and African diasporic, I forgot to be, art. And so we're doing a reading series there. We were just at Penn World Voices. So I guess just continuing to sort of operate from like and there's no, you know, we do everything as sort of an organization. There's a real democratic kind of decision-making process. But just sort of wanting to, I guess, connect certain levels of writing, you know, because our magazine, we just published John Keane and Carl Phillips, who just won a Pulitzer, but then having those authors next to emerging writers, you know, to sort of give like emerging Black writers across the diaspora, like, you know, that look, that's a great look. And just kind of bridging that gap and continuing the mutual aid sort of idea. So that's kind of what I'm currently doing.
So the Lit 16 came really out of two experiences. There's a writer who's actually here for the Oxford Conference of the Book, and he reached out to me and to PSA and Robert and shared that maybe 2 weeks before the publication of his book, his publisher had not done anything in terms of setting up a tour, not even virtual, nothing. And so the three of us went into our contacts list and we drafted an email that all pretty much said the same thing, and reached out to every bookseller and you know, conference and everybody who had invited us to do things. We said, here's a writer you should know, here's what the book is about, here's what we said about it when we blurbed it, and as you're building your calendar of events, please consider this writer. and from that, he was able to go to tour. So that happened, and then fast forward, there were two writers who were also debuting, who I had blurbed each of their books, and they reached out and said, we have this idea, and we think you should have a reading series called Deesha Philyaw Presents, and I was like, oh. So I was like, that's not going to happen. And then I told PSA and Robert about it, and we're like, what can we do to kind of scale up what we did for the writer who didn't have a tour? Because there's definitely a need. Even when writers are signed with the Big Five, and maybe even especially when they are, and we found too, it doesn't even matter, even if you get a big advance, because sometimes they just don't put the marketing dollars behind Black books. And so we thought, okay, what if we chose a group of writers and did use our platforms to just raise their profile and, see what happens, and all what we initially were thinking was like, we would do a reading series, it would be quarterly, so we'd have 4 readers at a pop, and then, we'd use our social media channels to just celebrate them and kind of blast them, and we invited some booksellers and some podcasters, bookstagram folks, to join us as partners, so, have them on as guests, or, everybody who, the booksellers go to bookshop.org and create a curated list, so somebody can easily buy all 16 books if they want. So that was our plan. The response was incredible, and first the booksellers, because we thought we were just going to get on Zoom, the 3 of us, with like my Zoom account, and then talk to these writers. The booksellers were like, oh, we'll host them. And we ended up having more booksellers wanting to host. We only had 4, events, and immediately they said, we'll do it. So we didn't have to worry about doing the logistical stuff. And then they were starting to get booked as for podcasts. And then we had some folks reaching out to us who had heard about it and said, how can we get in touch with these writers? And we were able to say, here's their contact information. And also the writers themselves, their publicity directors from their publishers, some of them said, oh, they're now paying attention to me. And so our email list became writers, publicists, all of those folks. And so people started paying attention in-house that should have been paying attention, all along. So they were getting invitations beyond just our series. And so July 13th, I think, will be the last in the series. And we've been thinking a lot about what happens next. And we're not sure when we're going to do it again, but we want the current 16 to nominate the next 16. So it's not just who we pick. And this time we looked at like the year before, the current year, and early in the next year, so it's a broader span. Some of these writers, their books came out in 2021, so it kind of gave them a resurgence of interest. So yeah, that's how it came about.
That's great.
Very cool.
That's it.
Yeah. That was beautiful.
Yeah.